Go Jump in the Pool. A Bruno and Boots story by Gordon Korman. Chapter 15. For He's a Jolly Good Fellow. Mildred, I cannot imagine what this is about, said Mr. Sturgeon, knotting his tie. I'm not accustomed to being called to assembly by my students. If it has anything to do with fundraising, I promise you I shall wring their necks. I have no idea what it means, his wife said, putting the finishing touches on her hairdo. Bruno and Malvin showed up at the door at 4 o'clock and invited us to a special assembly after dinner. I've been phoning around to the faculty, and it seems that everyone is invited, but no one knows what it's about. If Walton and O'Neill are behind it, the headmaster said sourly, it's probably a new fundraising scheme. We shall all be held for ransom. Hurry now, she said, or we'll be late. We're to meet Miss Scrimmage outside the auditorium in 5 minutes. Miss Scrimmage? Why is she invited? Well, I don't know, dear. Let's go and find out. Mr. Sturgeon's fears were confirmed as he, his wife, and Miss Scrimmage were seated in the front row of the auditorium. On the platform were Bruno and Boots, Wilbur, Chris, Elmer, and Mark, the entire fundraising committee. To make matters more perplexing, the extra boy on the stage, George Wexford Smythe III, was known to be generally disliked. Where did he fit in? What was going on here? Because of the presence of Miss Scrimmage's girls, the auditorium was packed to overflowing. Students were sitting on the floor in the aisles. Bruno stepped up to the microphone and cleared his throat. Honored guests, fellow students, he began, and it was apparent that he had rehearsed very carefully. We are gathered here this evening to celebrate a memorable event. I would now like to call Mr. Sturgeon to the platform, as I have a few brief words to address to him. As Mr. Sturgeon joined him at the microphone, Bruno reached into his pocket and produced enough paper for a 2-hour speech. There were loud groans from the audience and several elaborate yawns. Mr. Sturgeon silenced everyone with one cold look. He felt like the leading actor in a farce and was not in a particularly good mood. Mr. Sturgeon, Bruno began, George Silver... Here, sir. His face flaming red and his speech forgotten, Bruno whipped an envelope out of his pocket and thrust it into the headmaster's hand. Great speech! Kathy Burton cheered from the back row. Mystified, Mr. Sturgeon opened the envelope and removed the contents. He found himself holding a check in the amount of $32,234.82. There was a long silence. The headmaster stared from the check to Bruno and back to the check again. It's for the pool, sir, Bruno stammered, with extra dressing rooms for the girls because they helped, and a sauna, and please, sir, can it be bigger than York Academy's pool, even if it's just a little bigger? An unfamiliar expression came over the headmaster's face. He took out his handkerchief and blew his nose loudly. In the front row, Mrs. Sturgeon was dabbing at her eyes with a lace hanky and trying to quiet Miss Scrimmage, who was sobbing uncontrollably. The cheering from the boys was deafening, and the girls were standing up and dancing wherever they could find room to put a foot down. Confetti flew like snow, and several boys waved handmade victory flags. Aren't you happy, sir? Shouted Bruno over the din. Very happy indeed, said Mr. Sturgeon. But where on earth did you get so much money? It's a very long story, sir, said Bruno hesitantly. Are you sure you want to hear it? Not at all sure, but perhaps I'd better. After the assembly, I want to see you and O'Neill privately in my office. Yes, sir, said Bruno, and we'd better bring George. Wexford Smythe III, said Mr. Sturgeon. I was under the impression that you did not even associate with him. George? Said Bruno in surprise. He's our best friend. He may look like a creep, but you can't judge a book by its cover. Very true, Mr. Sturgeon nodded. Boots approached them. Sir, he said, all the ruckus has died down now. Would you like to say a few words? Mr. Sturgeon nodded, blew his nose once again, and addressed the assembly. When I was called here tonight, I recall thinking that if this assembly had anything to do with fundraising, heads would roll. Fundraising has made this an interesting semester, to say the least. And now we are to have a pool. There was much stamping and whistling. Getting the pool has been the achievement of every boy and girl in this auditorium. For this reason, the name over the door of our pool will read, Students' Pool. Again, he was interrupted by wild cheering. I don't know how you did it, he went on. I'm shortly to be filled in on the details. I only want to say thank you, and to let you know that I am very proud of every one of you. To the sound of hundreds of young voices singing For He's a Jolly Good Fellow, Mr. Sturgeon left the stage and rejoined his wife. Well, William, she said happily, what do you think of that? A telephone, said Mr. Sturgeon abstractedly. We need a telephone in the sauna." His eyes took on a wicked gleam. "I want to phone Hartley from there. And I must also mention to him how lucky he is that his water bill will be so much smaller than ours." "Oh, William," she laughed, "you are pleased." He nodded. "And I can also invite Hartley's students to use our sauna, between the hours of 2 and 3 in the morning on nights when there is a full moon." His face grew grave. "Of course, first I have to find out where they got the money and whether or not we have to give it back." Bruno, Boots, and George sat in 3 comfortable swivel chairs facing the headmaster across his desk. "It's all very simple, sir," said Bruno. "George took our $7,500 and invested it in the stock market for us." "But you didn't have $7,500, protested Mr. Sturgeon, mystified. "Yes, sir," said Bruno, "but Kathy made horseradish cake and won $3,000 for us." "Oh," said Mr. Sturgeon oddly. "I see." "So," Bruno went on, "George invested our money." The headmaster stared at him. "I received reports that you and O'Neill had missed a few classes. I assume that would be trips to the bank and other financial transactions?" "Yes, sir," Bruno admitted. Mr. Sturgeon held his head. "Don't you two realize, and you too, Wexford Smythe, that you had no moral right to touch that money? I entrusted you with the responsibility of that bank account." "Yes, sir," said Bruno, "and we more than tripled it." "Yes," said Mr. Sturgeon, "but you might just as easily have lost it." George sat bolt upright in his chair. "Impossible, sir!" he exclaimed. "There is a science to the stock market. I had inside information on Lorelei mining from a reputable firm of geologists." "Lorelei mining?" repeated the headmaster. "That was your investment? You knew about Lorelei mining before it happened? Why, that was the biggest—" He caught himself and fell silent. "Are you very angry, sir?" asked Boots in a small voice. "Yes, and no," said Mr. Sturgeon. "You see, I am afraid that this experience may have taught you boys that you can do absolutely anything to achieve what you are after. Life is not like that. There are rules. At some point in your lives, you will have to give up something you want very badly because the means to get it will hurt someone else. Do you understand?" Yes, sir," chorused the 3 boys. "As for the money itself," said Mr. Sturgeon with a smile, "I could not be more pleased. I think, under the circumstances, that Wexford Smythe should be the first person to swim in our pool." "Oh, no, sir," said George quickly. "From a hygienic point of view, I feel pools are unsafe, and of course there is the ever-present danger of catching a chill." "Well, then," said the headmaster with a trace of amusement in his voice, "the honors should fall to the chairman of the fundraising committee. Bruno, you should be the first in our pool." Bruno turned deathly white. "Me, sir? Pool, sir? But I don't know how to swim." The end.